The screaming started in the women's quarters and didn't stop for 3 hours. It was November 1581, in the Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, Ivan the Terrible's fortified palace compound north of Moscow. The Tsar was in one of his rages, the kind that made servants flee and boyars lock themselves in their chambers. But this time, the target of his fury wasn't a political enemy or a suspected traitor. It was his son's pregnant wife, a 22-year-old woman named Yelena Sheremeteva, who'd committed the unforgivable sin of wearing the wrong clothing while relaxing in her private apartments. What Ivan did to Yelena that November afternoon set in motion a cascade of events that would culminate in the most famous act of violence in Russian history: the Tsar murdering his own son and heir with a blow from his iron-tipped staff. But the murder, immortalized in Ilya Repin's haunting painting, was the end of the story, not the beginning. The beginning was what Ivan did to a pregnant woman because she wasn't dressed formally enough for his standards. And what happened next, the miscarriage, the confrontation, the murder, and the psychological collapse that followed, reveals something darker and more complex than simple tyranny. This is the story of how a dress code violation escalated into filicide, and how that filicide broke something fundamental in one of history's most brutal rulers. It's a story preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, including testimony from witnesses, letters from foreign ambassadors, chronicles kept by Russian monks, and Ivan's own writings from his final years when guilt and madness had consumed him. I need to warn you, this gets dark. Ivan the Terrible earned his epithet through systematic cruelty that shocked even the violence-hardened 16th century. But what happened in November 1581 was personal violence, family violence, that crossed lines even Ivan had previously respected. Let me show you exactly what happened, and why the aftermath drove Ivan to a madness that lasted until his death 3 years later. Yelena Sheremeteva was Ivan's daughter-in-law, married to his eldest surviving son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. She was Ivan the Terrible's third daughter-in-law. The Tsarevich's previous 2 wives had died or been divorced under mysterious circumstances that court gossips attributed to the elder Ivan's interference. Yelena was pregnant with what would have been Ivan's first legitimate grandchild, crucially important in a dynasty that had been plagued by infant mortality and succession crises. She was approximately 6 months pregnant on that November day when Ivan entered the women's quarters unannounced. The women's quarters, the terem, were supposed to be private spaces where noble women could relax away from the rigid formality of court life. Russian court protocol was extraordinarily strict about women's dress and behavior in public, but the terem was one of the few places where these rules were relaxed. Yelena was resting on a couch, wearing a loose robe, a single layer of clothing instead of the multiple formal layers required for public appearance. She was pregnant, uncomfortable, and in private chambers where such informality was normal and accepted. Then Ivan burst in. Contemporary accounts differ slightly on why Ivan was in the women's quarters at all. Some suggest he was looking for his son, others that he was conducting one of his paranoid inspections of the palace. But all sources agree on what happened next. Ivan saw Yelena in her informal dress and exploded with rage. In his mind, she was showing disrespect to the dynasty, to Russian tradition, to his authority as Tsar. The fact that she was in private chambers, that she was pregnant, that loose clothing was practical and comfortable, none of this mattered. What happened next is described in multiple sources with remarkably consistent detail. The most detailed account comes from Heinrich von Staden, a German mercenary in Ivan's service who later wrote a memoir about his time in Russia. His description is graphic. The Tsar began beating the Tsaritsa, Yelena, with his staff. She fell to the ground, and he continued beating her, striking her body and belly repeatedly. The Tsaritsa was screaming, and the women attending her tried to intervene, but guards held them back. The beating continued until the Tsar tired himself. The Tsaritsa was left bloodied on the floor. The staff Ivan used was his famous posok, an iron-tipped walking stick that he carried everywhere and had used as a weapon before. It wasn't a ceremonial object. It was a functional weapon that Ivan had employed in previous acts of violence. Von Staden continues. The Tsaritsa was carried to her chambers. Physicians were summoned. That night, she went into early labor. The child was born dead, a boy, they said, though I did not see it myself. Other sources corroborate this account. The English ambassador Jerome Horsey, who was in Moscow at the time, wrote in his memoirs, "The Tsar in his fury beat his son's wife, being great with child, which caused her to miscarry and shortly after to die." Actually, Yelena didn't die immediately. She survived the miscarriage but was gravely injured. The beating and subsequent premature labor left her unable to bear more children and in constant pain. She would die about a year later, though sources differ on whether this was from lingering effects of the injuries or from other causes. But the immediate consequence wasn't Yelena's suffering. It was her husband's reaction. Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich was 27 years old in November 1581. He'd spent his entire life under his father's shadow, had watched his father execute thousands of people during the Oprichnina terror, had seen his father's paranoia and violence escalate year by year. But he'd also loved his wife. And now his father had beaten her so severely that she'd lost their child, Ivan's first child, the heir who would have continued the dynasty. The Tsarevich confronted his father the next day, after the miscarriage, after the physicians had told him his wife might not survive, after he'd seen Yelena's broken body and understood what his father had done. Multiple sources describe this confrontation, though they differ on exact details. The most complete account comes from Jacques Margaret, a French mercenary who served in Russia and collected testimony from people who'd been present. According to Margaret's account, the Tsarevich entered his father's private chambers and demanded to know why Ivan had attacked Yelena. The conversation escalated quickly. The Tsarevich was angry, his father was defensive and increasingly enraged. The younger Ivan made a fatal error. He questioned his father's authority. In Russian autocratic theory, the Tsar's will was absolute, divinely ordained, beyond question. By demanding justification for his father's actions, the Tsarevich was committing a form of treason, or at least that's how his father interpreted it. Heinrich von Staden describes what happened next. The Tsarevich spoke harshly to his father, saying he had murdered the Tsarevich's son and destroyed his wife. The Tsar raised his staff and struck his son on the head. The iron tip of the staff penetrated the skull. The Tsarevich fell, bleeding greatly. Other accounts provide slightly different details. Some say Ivan struck multiple times, others that it was a single blow. Some say that Tsarevich died immediately, others that he lingered for several days. But all agree on the essential facts. Ivan struck his son with the iron-tipped staff. The blow was to the head, and it was fatal. The English ambassador Horsey provides additional context. The emperor, Ivan, struck him on the head with his staff and wounded him to death, which he languished under some few days and then died. The most famous artistic representation of this moment is Ilya Repin's 1885 painting, Ivan the Terrible and His Son Ivan. The painting shows Ivan cradling his dying son, his face a mask of horror and grief, his hands covered in his son's blood. The Tsarevich stares upward with dying eyes while blood pools on the floor. The painting is accurate in emotional content, if not precise historical detail. Because what happened after the blow, in the minutes and hours after Ivan realized what he'd done, was a psychological collapse that witnesses described as the Tsar going mad before their eyes. The moment Ivan realized he'd killed his son, he transformed. The rage that had possessed him seconds earlier vanished, replaced by horror, so profound that witnesses compared it to demonic possession in reverse. As if the demon had left and Ivan suddenly understood what the demon had made him do. Von Staden. The Tsar fell upon his son's body, embracing him, calling his name, begging him to wake. He tore at his own beard and clothing. He screamed for physicians, for priests, for anyone who might help. But the wound was mortal, and the Tsarevich was dying. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich died on November 19, 1581, several days after the blow. Sources differ on exactly how long he lingered. Some say he died almost immediately, others that he was conscious for days. But all agree that he died from the head wound his father inflicted. During those days when his son was dying, Ivan the Terrible underwent a visible psychological transformation. The same man who'd executed thousands without apparent remorse was now consumed by grief and guilt so intense that it manifested physically. Jerome Horsey describes Ivan during this period. The emperor fell into a state of madness, tearing his hair and beard, refusing food, speaking to apparitions that only he could see. He declared himself a murderer before God and man, unworthy to rule, deserving of death. Ivan ordered masses to be said for his son's soul. He donated enormous sums to monasteries to pray for forgiveness. He wrote the Tsarevich's name in his personal synodicon, a list of the dead for whom he requested prayers, with notes about how the death occurred. One of these entries survives. In Ivan's own handwriting, "Remember, O Lord, the soul of thy departed servant, the Tsarevich Ivan, whom I, his father, in my rage did murder." The directness of that confession is striking. Ivan, who'd spent decades justifying every execution, every act of terror, every cruelty as necessary for state security or divine justice, admitted plainly that he'd murdered his son in a rage. But confession didn't bring relief. If anything, acknowledging guilt made it worse. After the Tsarevich's death, Ivan's behavior became increasingly erratic and self-destructive. The man who'd terrorized Russia for decades began terrorizing himself with guilt and religious obsession. He stopped sleeping in his royal chambers, instead spending nights in the palace chapel, prostrating himself before icons, praying for hours until he collapsed from exhaustion. He had monks read lists of his sins, including the names of people he'd executed, and would wail and beat his head against the floor when his son's name was mentioned. The French mercenary Jacques Margaret, who interviewed people who'd witnessed this period, describes Ivan's nightly ritual. Every night, the Tsar would go to the chapel and lie prostrate on the cold stone floor for hours, praying and weeping. Sometimes he would beat his head against the floor until he bled. His guards would hear him screaming in the night, sometimes prayers, sometimes curses, sometimes just incoherent sounds of anguish. Ivan began drafting a will and discussing abdication. He wrote letters to monasteries asking if he could retire there as a monk, a common practice for Russian rulers seeking forgiveness, but shocking from Ivan, who'd spent his life accumulating and exercising absolute power. One of these letters survives in the Trinity Sergius Monastery archive. Ivan writes, "I, the most sinful of all Christians, the murderer of my own son, the destroyer of my own dynasty, the one cursed by God and man, request permission to retire to your monastery to spend my remaining days in prayer and penance." The monastery's response, also preserved, is carefully diplomatic. They neither granted nor refused permission, instead encouraging Ivan to fulfill his duties as Tsar while also pursuing spiritual redemption. But Ivan's guilt manifested in more than just religious obsession. He became paranoid that his surviving son, Fyodor, would be assassinated as divine punishment for Ivan's crime. He surrounded Fyodor with guards, sometimes refusing to let him out of sight. This wasn't fatherly protection, it was obsessive, controlling behavior born of fear that God would take his remaining son to punish him for killing the first. The irony is that Fyodor was mentally incompetent. Contemporary descriptions suggest intellectual disability or mental illness. He'd never been considered a viable heir, which is why the death of Ivan Ivanovich was so catastrophic for the dynasty. Ivan had killed his capable son and was left with an heir who couldn't effectively rule. This realization seemed to deepen Ivan's guilt. He'd not only killed his son, but destroyed his own dynasty's future in a moment of rage over a pregnant woman's clothing. The psychological collapse was accompanied by rapid physical deterioration. Ivan was only 51 years old when he killed his son, but within months he looked decades older. Contemporary descriptions are consistent and vivid. Jerome Horsey. The emperor aged visibly, his hair turning white, his face becoming gaunt and haunted. He developed tremors in his hands and could no longer hold his staff, the same staff he'd used to kill his son, without shaking. The symbolic irony of losing the ability to hold the murder weapon wasn't lost on court observers, who saw it as divine judgment. Ivan's physical decline included symptoms that modern medicine might diagnose as severe depression, PTSD, and possibly the progression of syphilis, which Ivan likely had. He suffered from insomnia, nightmares when he did sleep, loss of appetite leading to significant weight loss, and episodes of what witnesses described as fits, where he'd shake uncontrollably and speak nonsense. A particularly disturbing detail from Heinrich von Staden's memoir: Ivan would sometimes mistake his surviving son Fyodor for the dead Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. He'd embrace Fyodor and beg forgiveness, then become angry when he realized his mistake, then collapse in tears at being reminded his son was dead. This wasn't just grief. This was a complete psychological break, a mind shattering under the weight of guilt it couldn't process or escape. Multiple sources report that Ivan claimed to be haunted by his son's ghost. This might be dismissed as superstition or propaganda, except that the reports come from diverse sources, including people sympathetic to Ivan and people hostile to him. According to several accounts, Ivan would wake screaming in the night, claiming his son was standing at the foot of his bed, bleeding from the head wound, asking why his father had killed him. Servants would find Ivan cowering in corners, having conversations with someone no one else could see. One particularly detailed account comes from Ivan's personal physician, a German named Bomelius, whose letters to a colleague in Prague describe Ivan's condition. His Majesty suffers from visions in the night and sometimes during the day. He sees his deceased son and converses with this apparition as if it were real. When I attempted to explain these as products of his grief-disturbed mind, he became angry and insisted his son truly visits him as punishment from God. Whether these were genuine hallucinations, products of guilt and insomnia, or something else entirely, they terrified Ivan. He ordered priests to perform exorcisms in his chambers. He had holy water sprinkled throughout the palace. He wore blessed amulets to ward off his son's ghost. Nothing worked. The haunting, real or imagined, continued until Ivan's death. Ivan survived his son by less than 3 years. From November 1581 to March 1584, he was a broken man going through the motions of ruling, while consumed by guilt, fear, and religious mania. He attempted several times to abdicate, drafting formal documents that would transfer power to his son Fyodor and a regency council. Each time, the boyars and church officials would convince him to withdraw the abdication. They feared the instability that would result from a mentally incompetent Tsar taking power, while his father was still alive but unwilling to rule. So Ivan remained Tsar in name, but increasingly ineffective in practice. The day-to-day administration of Russia fell to a council led by Boris Godunov, who would later become Tsar himself. Ivan spent his final years in religious obsession and self-punishment. He fasted excessively, participated in hours-long religious services, made pilgrimages to monasteries, and gave away enormous amounts of wealth to churches and charitable causes. One of his last acts was creating a detailed list of everyone he'd executed during his reign, thousands of names, and donating money to have prayers said for all of them. The list survives and is one of the most important sources for understanding the scale of Ivan's terror. But the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich's name appears first, written in larger script than the others with the note, "By my own hand in my madness." In March 1584, Ivan was preparing for a game of chess when he collapsed. He died within hours, possibly from a stroke. He was 53 years old. His death might have been natural, or it might have been poisoning. Several contemporary sources suggest assassination, though no definitive proof exists. Given the chaos of his final years and the number of people who might have wanted him dead, either explanation is plausible. Ivan's death left Russia in the hands of Fyodor I, who was indeed incapable of ruling effectively. Real power fell to Boris Godunov and other boyars, beginning a period of instability that would eventually lead to the time of troubles, a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and near collapse of the Russian state. This crisis was directly traceable to Ivan's murder of his heir. If the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich had lived, if he'd succeeded his father as planned, Russian history might have been very different. Instead, Ivan's moment of rage over a pregnant woman's clothing choice cascaded into the destruction of his dynasty and decades of chaos. The murder itself became legend. Stories proliferated, details were exaggerated or invented, the incident took on mythic dimensions. By the 19th century, when Ilya Repin painted his famous depiction, the murder had become the defining moment of Ivan's reign, more famous than any of his military victories or administrative reforms. But most versions of the story focus on the murder itself, the dramatic moment of violence immortalized in Repin's painting. They skip over what preceded it, the beating of Yelena, the miscarriage, the death of Ivan's first grandchild. And they often skip over what followed, the psychological collapse, the haunting, the complete disintegration of a personality that had been held together by force of will and the exercise of power. Ivan the Terrible earned his epithet through decades of systematic cruelty. But the murder of his son broke something fundamental in him that no amount of power could fix. He discovered that some acts are so heinous that even an absolute autocrat cannot escape their consequences. Was Ivan genuinely mad, or was his behavior after the murder a political performance designed to evoke sympathy and avoid accountability? This question has occupied historians for centuries. The evidence suggests genuine psychological collapse. Ivan's behavior was too consistent across too many private moments, witnessed by too many different people with different motivations, for it all to be performance. The religious obsession, the nightmares, the hallucinations, the physical decline, these align with modern understanding of severe trauma responses and guilt-induced mental illness. Moreover, performance doesn't make strategic sense. An absolute autocrat doesn't need to fake remorse to maintain power. If anything, appearing weak and guilt-ridden endangered Ivan's position. A czar who prostrates himself in churches and claims to be haunted by his victim's ghost is inviting coup attempts. The fact that Ivan maintained his regime until his natural death suggests his boyars and military commanders saw something genuine in his breakdown. Not weakness to be exploited, but suffering so profound it compelled a kind of horrified respect. There's also Ivan's own writings from this period. Private letters and documents that weren't intended for public consumption show the same guilt and anguish as his public behavior. Unless Ivan was maintaining an elaborate deception even in private writing, we have to take his psychological state seriously. What broke Ivan wasn't just killing his son. He'd killed thousands of people without apparent remorse. What broke him was understanding that he'd destroyed his own dynasty, murdered his own successor, ended his own bloodline, all in a moment of rage over something as trivial as improper clothing. The absurd disproportion between the trigger, Yelena's informal dress, and the eventual consequence, the destruction of the Rurik dynasty that had ruled Russia for 700 years, was something Ivan couldn't rationalize or justify. This wasn't necessary state violence. This wasn't removing threats to security. This was just rage and cruelty cascading into catastrophe. And Ivan, who'd spent his life convinced that every act of violence served a higher purpose, suddenly couldn't maintain that delusion. The purpose of beating Yelena? Asserting dominance over someone who couldn't fight back. The purpose of killing his son? None. It was an accident born of rage, not a planned execution. For a man who'd built his identity around being God's instrument of divine justice, this recognition of meaningless evil in himself was psychologically annihilating. The chain of causation is almost absurdly direct. Ivan saw his daughter-in-law wearing informal clothing. He beat her. She miscarried. His son confronted him. He killed his son. His dynasty ended. Russia descended into chaos. Each step was preventable. At any moment, Ivan could have controlled his rage, could have recognized the absurd disproportion of his reaction, could have stopped the cascade before it became irreversible. But he didn't. And the consequences, personal, dynastic, and national, were catastrophic. The story of how Ivan the Terrible punished his son's pregnant wife, and what happened next isn't just about one man's cruelty or madness. It's about how small acts of violence can cascade into historical catastrophe. It's about how absolute power doesn't protect against consequences. It just makes the consequences more devastating when they arrive. And it's about how guilt, when it finally arrives for someone who's lived without it for decades, can be psychologically annihilating. Ivan the Terrible committed thousands of acts of cruelty during his reign, but the one that destroyed him was the most personal, murdering his own son in a rage that started because a pregnant woman wore the wrong clothes. That's the story Rome tried to hide. That's what drove Ivan the Terrible mad. And that's why, nearly 450 years later, Repin's painting of a father cradling his murdered son still has the power to disturb anyone who understands what led to that moment. The screaming in the women's quarters that November afternoon in 1581 didn't stop with Yelena. It echoed through Russian history for generations.